Yeah, well, it has over these last decades been really quite amazing for me to watch in my own life and with my clients and students how powerful, whether it's training in mindfulness directly or the compassion practices, loving kindness, awareness practices, how powerful they are at changing our relationship with emotions in a way that really frees us up. And I think of it that we're in this amazing juncture, in terms of human evolution, that we're able to directly evolve and awaken our own hearts and minds and consciousness. And so I thought maybe I'd offer an illustrative story of kind of the way I understand the path, and then explore with those that are listening and watching some ways that we can practice that can really free us in a way with fear, with shame. So the story is, and this is a true story, about 15 years ago, there there's this huge statue in Asia, in Southeast Asia, and it's a statue of the Buddha. It's in Thailand, actually. It's an enormous clay Buddha. It's not. It wasn't this very beautiful statue at all. Very loved. It had survived over the centuries through storms and battles and different rulers. But about 15 years ago, after a long dry season, there's some cracks that appeared in the statue, and one monk took a flashlight, shined it into the crack, and what shined back at him was a flash of gold. So he checked the other cracks, and it turned out that under the covering, this was a pure gold, solid gold statue. It was the largest in Southeast Asia. And I know people that have visited. It's a very compelling presence. So what's interesting is the monks say that the statue was covered to protect it through tumultuous times, much in the same way that we cover over our innate purity and goodness as we move through a difficult world. And the suffering that we encounter is because we get identified with that plaster clay covering, what you might call our egoic strategies, the ways we try to control or defend or are aggressive to make it through. And so we get identified. We identify with our limiting stories about ourselves and with the emotions that bind us, and we forget who's looking through the mask. We forget the goal, that loving heart that's here. And so I think of really the work of meditation is that it shines a light on the coverings. We begin to see, they become transparent. So we have more and more contact with the awakeness and the awareness and the love that's really who we are. And when we're identified, we're in a trance. And through many spiritual traditions, the notion of how we really move through the day as kind of a trance that many of you who are here right now listening know it, that we get very mechanical and automatic in our ways of moving. And often our sense of who we are is as a fearful self or a wanting self. And rather than really sensing a kind of wholeness of being. So when we're stuck in trance, the starting place for healing or freeing ourselves up is right where we are with whatever's coming up. I often think of a line from the poet Rumi who says that our path is not to seek for love, but to find the barriers we've created against it. So our starting place when we're in trance is just right with what's here. And you can even just ask yourself, I think a really valuable question in any moment is, what is between me and happiness or presence right in this moment? What is between me and presence in this moment? And what we start discovering is what I call the common features of trance, which is if we really shine a light on this moment, we might notice, oh, I wasn't connected to my body. And I was caught in kind of thinking about things. And many of our moments we're thinking of what's coming up. We're trying to figure things out, or we're on our way somewhere else. So the first key part of meditation training that we explore really is, how do we notice when we're lost in thoughts and come back? How do we come back? The first step out of trance is to learn how to notice we've been in thoughts and in some way get it that I don't have to believe my thoughts. I'm not my thoughts. You know, our mind secretes thoughts, our brain secretes thoughts, just like the body secretes enzymes. They're natural. So it's not about being at war with them, but just training to not be lost to them. One of the phrases I most like is real but not true. Our thoughts are real, they're happening, but they're not the truth of what's going on in our lives. So that's step one in waking up out of the trance, is to notice we've been lost in thoughts. And again, so we ask ourselves, what's between me and loving presence or happiness? And we say, oh, okay, lots of thinking. But then there's something else, which is that our thoughts and our emotions have a kind of negativity bias, which means that through evolutionary history, in order to survive, we got conditioned to pay attention to what might be a problem. So if you start watching mindfully what's going on inside you as you move through the day, there's a kind of mantra about something's wrong, something's a problem, something's not okay. And that is another part of trance, that we think something's not okay. And beyond that, underneath that really, we think we're not okay. And this is where we get into how do we start working with difficult emotions, because if you look under maybe feelings of depression or feelings of anger or even fear, usually underneath it is a fear of failure, of personal failure, that we are in some way flawed. One woman expressed it very powerfully. This is a woman who was dying, and she was going in and out of a coma. And finally, the last moments that she was awake, her daughter was with her, and she looked her daughter in the eyes and she said, you know, all my life, I thought something was wrong with me. And then she went back into a coma, and that was it. And in a way, for her daughter, those last words were very powerful, because it made her realize just how deep it is and how pervasive it is, that we feel like something is flawed or deficient about ourselves. So I call this the trance of unworthiness. And this is one of the key places that we can bring meditation practice, we can bring mindfulness and compassion to free ourselves. You know, I think about how one palliative caregiver who had worked with thousands and thousands of people, she reported that the biggest regret of the dying is, I really didn't live true to myself. You know, I lived according to others' expectations. I lived according to shoulds. When we're in the trance of unworthiness, we don't trust ourselves. And so we end up building our lives around how we think we should be. We leave ourselves. We leave our body, we leave our heart, our presence. And in a way, you can consider it that our deepest sickness is homesickness, the sense of not being at home with ourselves. You know, Carl Jung, in describing suffering, he said, the cause of suffering for their children and their own suffering is the unlived life of the parents. The unlived life of the parents. And he wasn't just talking about not pursuing dancing or not pursuing that world trip. He was really talking about the unlived loneliness, the loneliness we weren't willing to feel, the unlived grief, fear, longing, the passion that we didn't open to. So if we think of that golden Buddha, and we think of the coverings, the plaster clay, the coverings are all the ways that we kind of defend against and deny and stay away from that real live energy in us that wants to be lived. And what meditation practice teaches us is how to stop leaving, how to stop, solidifying that covering and instead come into our aliveness and be willing to be with the vulnerability. And when we bring a meditative presence to the different energies that are there, that identification starts dissolving. In other words, we stop feeling the sense of I am that fearful self. And it allows the gold to shine through. We start trusting more and more the quality of love and care that's really our essential being. And I think it's interesting when you consider in an evolutionary way that through our evolutionary history, our conditioning has been when there's discomfort, when there's difficulty, to fight, flight, freeze, or to grasp. And the shift here with meditation is to move from that reactivity to responding instead by attending and befriending. And this is the essence of meditation that I'd like to really emphasize here, is that there are two wings to awareness. And one wing is the wing of attending or recognizing what's here. It's the wing of understanding. You can say it in terms of a question, what is happening inside me right now? That's the wing of mindfulness. And the other wing of awareness is the wing of love, which is the wing that says, and may I be with this? May I let it be? May I just allow it to be here with some tenderness? There's a wonderful story from the mythology of the Buddha, whereby, the Buddha, through the night of his awakening, was attacked by the shadow side, all the difficult emotions of anger and fear and shame and hatred. And through the night, the Buddha practiced meditation. He brought these two wings of recognizing what was happening and allowing what was going on to be there with deep, deep care and presence. And by the morning, all those shadow energies, which came in the forms of rocks and slings and arrows and so on, just turned to flower petals and were at a heap at his feet. But here's what's interesting. The shadow side, which is described as the god Mara, kept on appearing through his life. And every time Mara would appear, so that's like saying in our lives that fear keeps coming, or anger keeps coming, or a sense of shame keeps arising. Each time those shadow energies would arise, the Buddha would look at Mara and say, I see you, Mara. Come, let's have tea. Let's have tea. So he was basically offering these two wings of awareness through his life. I see you, Mara. That's the wing of mindfulness. And come, let's have tea. That's the wing of loving presence. In a way, you can think of it as, in our earlier evolutionary conditioning, rather than having tea with Mara, we basically were saying, no, this is bad. This is a problem. But as we begin to wake up our awareness, we shift to attend and befriend, where we're saying yes. We're saying yes to reality. We're saying, yes, this is what's happening right now. One of the first times that I very formally had tea with Mara, I was doing a meditation retreat, and I had come to retreat with a sinus infection. And I also was I was just in the process of getting divorced. And so I had a lot of shadow energies going on, a lot of aversion to feeling sick and anxiety about the divorce. And the room we were practicing in was overheated, and then it would switch to being too cold because people would open up the windows, and it was in the middle of winter. So I was in a very no space, no, this is a problem, I don't like this. So I decided to practice having tea with Mara in the form of a yes meditation. And what I did was every time anything would come up, let's say a feeling of ache or heaviness or tiredness because I was sick, I would just name that. I would say unpleasant sensations, and then I'd say yes. And then the next thing would come up, all these obsessive thoughts about what was going to happen in terms of this divorce process. And I would just name it. Okay, obsessing, anxious. And then I'd say yes. So I kept throwing yes at whatever happened. This is my attending and befriending. And at first it was kind of mechanical, but then it became humorous. And then I started noticing there was more and more space. Every time I said yes to what was going on inside me, there would just be a little more room for what was there. And then gradually with the yes, it became very tender. That space became kind of soft and kind. And over the period of that retreat, I felt a much deeper understanding of these two wings of awareness that were evolving, of being able to simply name what's happening and say yes to it, and how that shifted my relationship with whatever emotion was going on. So instead of being the anxious self worried about the divorce, I felt more that I was resting in that compassionate space that's just relating to the different waves of experience. A very much deeper sense of freedom and ease. So I'd like to, with you, just take a short pause and invite you to experiment a little with having tea with Mara, experiment with this yes meditation.
Well, while we take this pause, just want to remind everyone that Tara has an online course about meditation and psychotherapy, and the link will be in the description below. Well, let's get back to a meditative tea with Mara and this yes meditation with Tara Brach.
So wherever you are, just you might take a moment to close your eyes and sit in a way that allows you to be relaxed and alert. And maybe take a few nice full breaths just to gather your energy and your attention right here. And you might bring to mind a situation in your life that evokes a reaction that's a reaction of anger or fear or discomfort or embarrassment. Not something that brings up a traumatic reaction, but something that's a no. No, I don't like this. This shouldn't be going on. Just some situation that recurs where you get triggered. And take a moment to bring a situation like that to mind and let yourself go right to the part of that situation that's aggravating. You might even kind of freeze the frame where you get most triggered and take a moment to examine with mindfulness the old conditioning, the conditioning of what we might call fight, flight, freeze, or grasping, the way that your attitude is basically saying, no, this is a bad thing happening. It's your fault or it's my fault. Something's wrong here. You might even mentally whisper no, just to get a sense of what happens when we're in some way at war with what's going on, not liking it. No, no. And as you're investigating, sense what happens in your body when you're saying no to what's going on, when you're saying no to the anger, the fear, the hurt, the embarrassment. What's it like in your heart when you're saying no? You might just imagine if days and weeks to come, every time this comes up and there's that part of you that's saying no, what goes on in your body each time, your heart each time? And then taking a few full breaths. same situation. In fact, reconnect if you've lost some of the immediacy of it, of whatever triggers you, something a person's saying, expression on their face, the setting. So just feeling that and sensing that. But this time, whatever you're experiencing inside you, begin to instead attend and befriend. You might simply name it, okay, anger, and then yes. Or fear, yes. Embarrassed, yes. So that whatever you're noticing inside you, a very gentle whisper of yes, or energetically communicating yes. And yes means not, I like this, but yes is acknowledging this is reality, allowing reality to just be there right now. A gentle yes. You're not saying yes to the person like, yes, you can go ahead and violate me. You're saying yes to the inner experience of feeling in some way hurt or in some way offended. So you're saying yes to what's inside you, letting life be just as it is. And as you attend and befriend this inner experience, notice what happens in your body. Notice how your heart experiences that gentle yes. You might imagine in the days and weeks to come, if when this situation arises, if you notice the old patterning of fight, flight, freeze, grasp, of saying no to the situation, and instead just took a few full breaths and practiced these two wings of awareness, of noticing what's happening and allowing it, allowing, saying yes to the life of the moment. How much more choice, how much more possibility there'd be. So again, take a few full breaths and feel free to shift around your posture and open your eyes. We're going to take this one more step. This gives you a basic sense of how you can bring mindfulness and heartfulness, these two wings of recognizing what's going on mindfully and heartfully saying yes, how you can bring them to a difficult emotional situation. And again, I want to emphasize you're not saying yes to the external situation, whether it's interpersonal or even to a situation in the world that you consider to be something that violates our world. You're saying yes to your inner response so that you can make room for the life that's here. Now, sometimes when we encounter the shadow, the God Mara, the difficult emotions, they're so strong and so sticky, we need to deepen our attention even more than simply saying yes. And I'd like to share with you an acronym that's easy to remember and that can help you with these two wings of awareness when you're working with strong emotion. And then we'll end up our time together and I'll guide you in a meditation using the whole acronym. So the acronym is RAIN, and the way it unpacks itself is this. The R is to recognize, and that's again that first wing of just recognizing or noticing what's happening. And the A is the second wing, to allow it. So that's the beginning, and with recognizing and allowing, you're basically creating space for the life that's right here. But as I said, if it's sticky, if it's intense, if it's difficult, you might need to deepen presence, and that's where the I comes in. The I means investigate, and it's not an analytic or mental investigation, it's an embodied inquiry, where you actually bring the inquiry of, well, what's really happening right into your body so you can begin to contact directly and courageously what's actually happening. So that's the I, is to really inquire, what's the truth that's going on inside me? And the N is to then nourish what's here with kindness. Recognize, allow, investigate, and nourish. Now, just like after a real rain, and rain is absorbed by the earth and flowers end up blossoming, similarly, after you do the acronym of RAIN, that's the time to rest and feel the flowering of a kind of sense of inner freedom and ease and presence. And that's as important as the RAIN steps. And I'll give you an example of RAIN, and where I found a very helpful woman who was at war with her daughter, in a sense, who was a senior in high school and had hit a skid, kind of where she had been a good student, but no longer. Her grades slid, and she was smoking a lot of marijuana, and she was online a lot, and the more her mother got angry and upset and controlling, the more her daughter got defensive and withdrawn. So they were at a standstill. And she came in and to explore, well, how can I gain more flexibility and reconnect with my daughter? And we decided to explore RAIN and started right with the anger she was feeling towards her daughter. So that's something to note, that when you're working with RAIN, you start exactly with what's most predominant. And she recognized the anger and she allowed it to be there. And that's a big deal, because often we'll say, well, I shouldn't be angry. But she just let it be there. Recognize, allow. The I of RAIN, investigate, as she investigated and felt into the anger in her body, the heat and the swelling and so on. What she found is underneath it was fear. She was afraid that her daughter was going to fail, was going to have a bad life. And when she stayed with the feelings of fear, she found even under that was a sense of personal failure, of shame, that she had let her daughter down. And when she investigated, she sensed that shame, she had been living with that shame her whole life, because it wasn't just letting her daughter down. It was in some way failing, really, in every relationship. And as she felt into that, there also came a deep sense of grief and sadness about how she had been moving through her life. Well, that's the I of RAIN. And then she, with the N of RAIN, I invited her to put her hand on her heart and just send whatever message of kindness might be helpful to the part of her that felt like such a failure, that was fearful and ashamed. And she sent a simple message, which is, I'm sorry, and I love you. And she did that process over and over again until she started, instead of moving around with all that anger and fear and shame, she more and more was resting in what happens after RAIN, which is that sense of presence, where she was no longer the mother that was failing, but more she was that compassionate awareness that was just bearing witness to the situation. And that enabled her then to bring to mind her daughter and see more clearly her daughter's struggle and have her heart open to her daughter, which really expressed itself energetically. And the two were able to have a bit of a rapprochement where they could start talking again. So this is an example of RAIN, that we practice it within ourselves, but naturally it can extend. Now I'm going to add one more piece before we practice together, which is that sometimes we're so feeling stuck and so regressed, we can't even offer that N of RAIN, that nourishing, to ourselves. Many people, when they practice RAIN, will recognize and allow, and they'll investigate in their body, but the feelings are so strong that they feel regressed, too young to even be able to offer some nourishment. And in a way, the reaction is so big that they have very little sense of resources. And one of the ways I've come to understand this, I want to share with you, Dan Siegel, who's a friend, psychiatrist, author, many of you may have heard of him, has a hand model of the brain that can show us what happens when we really get triggered, that I think is so useful. And you might raise your hand right now and just look at your hand and place your thumb in the middle of your palm and your forefingers over the top. And this is a useful model of the brain. So let's look quickly, we'll just walk through what happens when we get stressed and triggered. This wrist represents a spinal cord, and then you have it coming into the lower palm. This is the brain stem, and the thumb is the limbic area, right? So this works together in regulating arousal. When you roll your fingers over, that's the higher cortex, okay? So the limbic area, fight, flight, freeze, emotions, this is all subcortical. The cortex, this higher part of our brains, what allows us to think and to reason. And this frontalmost part of the brain, this right behind your forehead, is the part that has the capacity for mindfulness and empathy. So this regulates the limbic and the brainstem areas, okay? Now, that's important because when you're stressed or tired or triggered with emotional reaction, if the prefrontal area is not activated, if it's not well integrated, what can happen is messages come up, and if it's not sending a message down saying, it's okay, that was then and now is now, instead, a message will come up, danger, danger, and you flip your lid, okay? That's what happens. And when we flip our lid, we lose access to this part of our brain that helps us to hold our own being with kindness, that helps us have perspective, that helps us then behave in ways that are intelligent and helpful to the world. So the question is, if we're doing RAIN and we flipped our lid, how do we work with that? Now, I'll share briefly a story that is, I think, describes well. It's another mother-daughter story whereby a woman's daughter was abused by this woman's then husband when she was young. And as an adult, she and her mother went into therapy. And so this woman got confronted with the fact that her daughter had been abused by her ex-husband, and it triggered her into a feeling of being suicidal. She felt like the depth of shame and anger and so on. And she was so triggered that she went to see a Jesuit priest that she had been a teacher for her when she was in college. She was now retired. And what he did was he said, let me have your hand. And he took her hand and he drew a circle in the middle of her hand and said, this is where you're living right now. And it's in a place of great reactivity and rage and hurt and fear and shame. And you have to feel this. But you also need to feel this. And he put his big priestly palm over hers and he said, this is the kingdom of God. This is the kingdom of mercy. And if you can remember that great love, if you can touch this, the feelings, but remember that loving presence, you will discover a freedom and a healing you never knew possible. So for months, instead of the mindfulness practice of being with the experience by herself, when she'd recognize and let those feelings be there and get in touch with them with the investigating, she would feel that priest's hand over hers, and she'd feel a kind of merciful, loving presence in the universe, a divine presence in the universe, helping to hold her own pain. And she told me it was after probably 8 months of that she could begin to sense that it was her own love that she was holding her inner life with. But it took that bridge. And I want to share that with you because as you practice mindfulness and as you practice compassion, it is completely intelligent and skillful to call on the love in the universe in whatever form or vessel you can begin to relate to, and gradually you'll discover that that's really already within you. So we'll practice this reign of self-compassion of, I'm going to invite you and you can begin to think of what you might want to bring it to come up with a situation where you feel stuck. But I want to just give you a few other pieces to know about with reign. And one is that it doesn't have to feel complete. You don't have to do it and say, oh, that's all taken care of. In fact, often it's just a matter of degree, that you'll feel a little less identification, a little more of a sense of resting in a larger awareness, which really is the shift that evolves our consciousness. And one of the metaphors I find helps is to imagine, the way they color a cloth indigo, that brilliant color of indigo. You take a white cloth and dip it into dye and then pull it up and it'll have that brilliant indigo, but it fades really quickly. So it's just a little off white. So you dip it back into the dye, you pull it up, and it's a tiny bit more blue. But after many rounds, the cloth holds that deep, brilliant, beautiful blue. And so it is with meditation, that every time you choose to stay and be present and touch into what's right here, you'll get a little more familiarity and stability and confidence in that presence until over time you'll come to trust that loving presence more as the truth of who you are than any limiting story that you tell yourself. And that's the blessing, or that's the gift as we evolve our consciousness, that you start trusting really who you are. And if you ask yourself, who am I if I'm not believing that something's wrong? And you might ask yourself that. Who am I if I'm not believing there's something wrong with me? Who am I if I'm not believing there's a problem to be solved? And we start discovering that we're inhabiting a much more vast and formless and luminous space of being. One last piece is that as we wake up to what we call that goal, that luminous awareness of who we are, we start looking at each other and much more quickly, instead of seeing the covering, that, the egoic mask, or, the covering of the golden Buddha, the defenses, the aggressions, instead of seeing that, we'll see it, but we'll also see beyond it. It's much more transparent to our eyes to seeing the goodness in another person. And one friend of mine who is a business executive, and he was having major challenges with his temper, and he's now a friend. When the way he got to know me was listening to podcasts and how we can work with emotions, and he decided he wanted to work with his anger. And we just had one time where he came to a workshop and we met on a break, and I talked to him about the two wings I told you, of just recognizing what's happening and saying yes to it within yourself. Recognize the anger, recognize that things are out of my control feeling, that angst, that pressure. Just say yes and give some space, and you'll have more choice. So we practiced it, and he came to class a couple of months later and shared with me that one of his project managers had come in to explain and report, that they were really behind schedule. And typically, this guy would just launch into the guy, just lay him out, lay him down, just really, really lose his temper. And instead, he found his temper rising, because if this project was slowed down, he'd be the one to have to speak for it. He slowed down, and inside himself, he just kind of noticed, okay, angry, and he kept saying yes, and he actually, very gentle yes, he found he had some more space, and he started looking at this guy as he was speaking and sensing not only his earnestness, but how really dedicated this guy was, and how he'd been dedicated, really good heart. And instead of laying into him, he spoke what he appreciated. He said, I get it. It's behind. We'll have to work with it. But, I know how devoted you've been. And the guy's eyes teared up, and he said, I wasn't going to say this because I didn't want it to be like an excuse, but my wife has been diagnosed with cancer, and I've got 2 teens, and it's just a really hard time. And the 2 men hugged, which hadn't happened to this friend of mine before at work. And he told me afterwards that he said, 2 months earlier, I would have just lost it with this guy and lost an opportunity for connection and made his life harder, and just how grateful he was. And so it is with us, that we many times in our lives, and often many times in a day, end up reacting in ways that we wish we wouldn't, where we create distance, where we create those barriers that Rumi was talking about to love. And by training in these two wings of awareness, by training to slow it all down and to just say, okay, so what's happening inside me right now? And can I let this be? Can I have tea? It gives us access to the gold, to the most intelligent and kind and creative parts of our being, and that we can then bring that into our lives. So with that, let's take some time to practice together. This is a good time again to reset yourself for sitting. Again, find a position that's comfortable, that allows you to be awake and at ease. So with your eyes closed now, you might take a few full breaths again, extending the in-breath so it's long and deep, filling the chest and lungs, and extending the out-breath so it's slow, so you can feel the sensations of releasing the breath. And again, a nice long deep in-breath. And a slow out-breath, releasing, relaxing, letting go. And letting the breath resume in its natural rhythm, relaxing with the inflow and the outflow. And taking these moments to scan through your life right now and sense if there's a situation, a place of difficulty where you'd like to feel some healing, some freedom around the emotions that come up. And it might be a situation of conflict with somebody that's close to you, family member, friend. Might be something challenging going on at work. Something to do with your health, the way you react, or an addictive behavior. And with any of these, it may be that it has the theme of turning on yourself, getting down on yourself, not liking the way you're reacting and behaving. And as you come up with a situation, as if you're watching a movie, just roll the situation forward until you get to that frame where you feel you're most triggered. And here might be that you notice the space you're in, the room, the visual features. If you're with another person, let that person's face be close in so you can sense part of the expression that's triggering you, or if there's something that person's saying. And be aware of what's going on inside you, what it's like when this is happening, what's being tripped off for you. And this is where you pause, and this is where we begin to practice the mindfulness and heartfulness of rain by simply recognizing, okay, what's going on right now? You might just name what you're most aware of in the moment, just the most predominant features. It might be afraid or angry, confused. And with that, the A of rain is that question, can I let this be? Can I just allow this to be here right now? See if you can have that intention to just let it be. And the recognizing and allowing of what's here is what allows you to deepen attention, deepen these two wings. You can deepen the wing of mindfulness as you now, the eye of investigate. Bring that inquiry right into the body. You might just scan your body, the throat, the chest, the belly, and sense what you're feeling. As you're feeling your body, you might also just wonder, what am I believing when this is happening? In this situation, what am I believing? Am I believing that there's something wrong with me or with the other person? Am I believing that I'm unlovable? Am I believing that I'm always going to fail? Am I believing that the other person doesn't care about me? Am I believing that I can't trust this person? And if you sense that there's some core belief in there, then find out when you're believing that, when you're really believing it, how does that feel in your body? What's it like to really believe I'm unlovable? I'm flawed. Stay close in with your body. And part of investigating, you might actually let your body take the posture that most expresses what you're feeling. So you might find your shoulders hunch over a little. You might find your fists clench. Let your face take the expression. So you're investigating by really feeling from the inside out. When I'm stuck, what's it like? And feeling into the place in your body that feels most vulnerable. Sense, what does this place most want? What does it most need right now? Does it need to feel held or loved, forgiven, seen, understood? This is the eye of rain. And as you ask those questions and inquire and investigate, you can begin to move to the N of rain by shifting your posture a little and sensing that you're bearing witness to this part of you that's suffering, that's hurting, and that this is an opportunity to offer what's needed inwardly, to nourish. And I invite you to experiment by putting your hand on your heart, and you might vary the touch so that it's very tender, so that the touch helps to communicate that nourishing. And as you feel that touch, you might send whatever message you think will most comfort the part of yourself that's hurting. It might be, as that woman in the story said, I'm sorry and I love you. Our Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh says, darling, I care about this suffering. It might be simply, I'm here with you. But just sense the message that'll most resonate for this part within you. If you find it hard to offer a message to your own being, you might bring to mind somebody who's a caring, wise, loving being. Could be a person in your life that you know. Could be a spiritual figure. Could be a deity, like Kuan Yin or the Bodhisattva of compassion or the Buddha or Jesus. Could be the earth, great earth mother. Could be your dog or your cat. But a being that you sense is loving, and let that love and that energy flow through your hand and into your heart and your body, wherever it's most needed. This is the N of rain, to nourish. See if you can offer the love and receive it. Explore what it means to really let it in. Rumi says, don't turn away. Keep your gaze on the bandage place. That's where the love enters you. And as a way of finishing the meditation, just to trust that exactly what's unfolding is what's needed, and rest a bit. And notice that you can rest right now in the presence and the care that's here. You might even sense the difference between when you were caught in that frame as a kind of a smaller self that's reactive, and that there's more space, there's more awakeness, there's more tenderness. We'll close the meditation with a poem by poet Rashani Ray. There is a brokenness out of which comes the unbroken, a shatteredness out of which blooms the unshatterable. There is a sorrow beyond all grief which leads to joy, and a fragility out of whose depths emerges strength. There is a hollow space too vast for words, through which we pass with each loss, out of whose darkness we are sanctioned into being. There is a cry deeper than all sound, whose serrated edges cut the heart as we break open to the place inside that is unbreakable and whole. So again, taking those long, deep breaths, feeling yourself right here, awake and present, opening your eyes when you're ready. And thank you for taking that journey.
And thank you all for taking this journey with us. And be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. And if you'd like to get more from Tara Brach, you can access her course about meditation and psychotherapy. This is D.S. Yvonne at reprogrammingmind.com. Bye for now.